I guess you could put Billy's death kind of like in quotation marks, so to speak, as to whether or not you think it really does happen the way that it does. What do we know about his death?
February 13th.
February 13th, 1976. Anyone remember location? Chicago. This is the day before Valentine's Day. What was the second part?
The American Revolution was in 1776.
I wasn't alive then, nor were you, but yeah, it would be from a U.S. standpoint a bicentennial. I think that's how you spell it. And certainly the fact of 200 years for Declaration of Independence. How much emphasis Vonnegut's kind of thinking about that, I don't know with that. Although I would say he does kind of talk about how the nation has been broken up anymore. So empires do fall apart over time. And so maybe with that 1976, hey, after 200 years, it's time for the U.S. to fall apart. Could be a little bit of a commentary that he'd be having. I would say that date is significant. Jack gave me confused eyes. And yes, it was a Friday in 1976. That also could be part of it. Any idea what February 13th? February 13th, 1945. That's when the bombing of Dresden begins. So it's February the 13th, it's February the 14th, goes into February the 15th a little bit in 1945, certainly near the end of the war, shortly before you have the atomic bomb getting dropped in Japan. And Vonnegut even mentions that Chicago is going to be blown up by a hydrogen bomb afterwards within his little episode that he's going there. But I do think that, yeah, he would be purposely using February the 13th. Why? Besides what we associate with Unlucky 13, and maybe the fact that it was a Friday could be part of the whole 1976. But if you're taking a look at the death of Billy Pilgrim, why have that connection with February 13th? I mean, what are Billy's problems? If you think he has any. Somebody like possibility, so insanity taking place. I think one of the diagnoses that a lot of people would certainly use would be something like PTSD. He's witnessed this horrific event. So certainly in a very real sense, what happened to part of him on February the 13th, 1945? That was essentially, the beginning of the end. You do have a death that certainly took place. Maybe it's the death of his mind. Maybe it's the death of his common sense. Maybe it's the death of his humanity after witnessing all of those things. And he is so apathetic as a character and basically numbed everything going on, even before the bombing of Dresden, that you can't really do a compare contrast. But certainly, with Vonnegut being, the author, our main voice throughout, you would think that kind of the beginning of his death, or at least part death of his innocence, so to speak, or maybe being naive about how people are, certainly would have happened on February the 13th, 1945. So to end it on February the 13th, again, 31 years later, part of them's already gone on that date. Reinforce again, now this is when that physical end will take place. Unless he's still alive in some other moment. All time is all time, and you can kind of focus on only the good parts if you want. But I think that would certainly be that purposeful connection between those two events. He's already kind of begun to die there. Closure would kind of come on that same day. How do we get the title of the book? And where's that, how does it like kind of fit in within our storyline? SH5.
Well, I mean, that's where he wants, like, going from.
And who's he? Okay.
But also, maybe like, because whenever they were there, it was like through evidence, it was just telling, like, solid house
So Billy is housed there. Yeah, if you ever get lost, just say SH5 and they'll know where you're coming back. Who also is housed there? You got Vonnegut there. And kind of like during the bombing scene, you do get the I character coming back, where he's standing behind Billy, also kind of looking in to see what's going on in Dresden. And then you have the I returning at the very end of the book, where Vonnegut shows up again. By going with not just the place that Billy is housed, but also the fact that Vonnegut was there. There is no debate about the accuracy of that. It does lend a sense of what to a science fiction book that has aliens, time travel, fictional characters.
It makes it more like a mix between science fiction and historical fiction. It's like, that's historically accurate.
And you could even, not certainly for the whole entire book, because yeah, you could classify historical fiction certainly with a lot of parts, and some would debate you could with all the parts, I guess, if you want to go total conspiracy. But even just nonfiction, there is an element of truth to it. There is something that is tangible, a sense of reliability, credibility to it. It did happen. He was there. So you get a little bit of that element of truth to it. Is the whole thing true? Debatable. Again, not a question that Jordan's going to have to deal with. Would you like to meet a Tralfamadorians are good, defend, refute, qualify. Not going to happen. But are all of the elements within the text meant to be so far out there that they cannot be comprehended or understood by any of us? No, you do have these little bit of elements of truth. And again, having that date with February the 13th probably connects with that as well, that you can't simply discount everything that takes place. It's not total make-believe that would be happening. And yesterday we were talking about characteristics of good books and things of that nature. One of the things that we look for are elements of emotions. People were talking about sympathetic connections. When you do get these little reminders from time to time, just like you do with the humor that pops up, that element of truth kind of causes you to, wait a minute, step back, take everything in. All right, there's a little bit more of maybe a serious nature to it than we would necessarily think just by looking at the pictures that are throughout the book and all that kind of stuff. Whenever you see Derby, what words tend to accompany Derby? Poor. And then I'd say there's another one that comes right after it. Poor, old. And then I guess we include his first name. Oops. Why are we supposed to feel bad for him? And there's no suspense with it whatsoever at all, because again, he tells you that this is going to happen, certainly at the very beginning of the book. Yeah, and there's really not any kind of climactic moments that do take place. Could be him getting shot. You would think maybe the actual bombing of Dresden itself, but even that is, I don't want to say completely skipped, but it's not presented in the way that you necessarily expect. What is his response, though, to Howard Campbell and this whole speech idea that he is presenting? Yesterday on your quote quiz, I think you had the "we're going to have to fight the communists, sooner or later" line that Campbell does. How does Derby respond to Campbell and these ideas that he's throwing out, the propaganda, join our side?
He definitely disagrees. I forget what he said exactly. He doesn't
think it's around page 162, if I remember. I think.
He gave a speech about how wrong and was talking about how, like, as a very attacked by their convention, he was saying, like, the American form of government has freedom and justice and opportunities and fair pay for all.
Right, and Derby, it's not that he simply just disagrees, but at no time, and on page 164, it's the first full paragraph, and then it developed that Campbell was not going to go unanswered after all. Then, right on cue, poor old Derby, the doomed high school teacher, English teacher, lumbered to his feet for what was probably the finest moment in his life. And then you get this line, which we used in the preview video. There are almost no characters in the story and almost no dramatic confrontations because most of the people in it are so sick and so much the listless playthings of enormous forces. One of the main effects of the war, after all, is that people are discouraged from being characters. But old Derby was a character now. His stance was that of a punch-drunk fighter. His head was down, his fists were out front, waiting for the information and battle plan. Derby raised his head, called Campbell a snake. He corrected that. He said that snakes couldn't help being snakes, and that Campbell, who could help being what he was something much lower than a snake or a rat or even a blood-filled tit. So it's not only that he disagrees, but he vehemently disagrees, and he actually comes off as being a character, person. Some would kind of go hero, but he is the ultimate, at least in this moment, foil to whom? To Billy. Because of all actions, Derby actually, and this gets like bold, does something. No, he doesn't beat the snot out of him, but he stands up for himself. He does something patriotic. He actually takes action. And certainly there is going to be some irony that it's coming from the person who, hey, he's going to get shot for stealing a teapot, not exactly a heroic ending that's going to take place, but he comes across as actually still being human. And in that regard, he is a heroic character. Is he a martyr because of his death? No, he's not really dying for what his beliefs are, but he is taking action against something, against someone. So when you have a book that's basically calling out people for being apathetic, well, what's an example of how a person should act? Well, at least in this moment, it's not poor old Edgar Derby, but Derby is the way that you are supposed to be, stands up, does something. For those going, Billy's my hero, I'm just going to focus on the events that I want. This would kind of be that little bit of a wake-up call where, no, you have to do something. You have to at least say something, have some kind of action taking place. Derby's able to exemplify that at least a little bit. When Billy talks about Dresden, who's he usually talking to? At least hospital scene. Also one of the guys from our quote quiz yesterday. He's talking to Rumford. And of course, Rumford doesn't really believe him all that much. And, just wants people to know that he was there and all these kinds of things. When he starts really recalling Dresden, I'd say the main thing to keep in mind is it comes after what horrific scene for him or moment in his life. This is after plane crash. What's happened to Valencia at this point? She's had the carbon monoxide poisoning from her crash. I don't know if it's right to say how should Billy act or how would you expect Billy to act. Billy's in a plane crash, in a coma. People kind of view him being a vegetable. I guess he would be a chronic as opposed to an acute if we're going back to cuckoo's nest. Wakes up, you're going to find out that your wife is deceased. How's he supposed to act, or what would be expected of him to act?
A normal person, you'd expect him to be sad.
What, those not normal?
But he doesn't really care about anything, and like he doesn't even care about Valencia that much.
Okay. Does that make him bad?
Doesn't make him good.
Fair response. I could be.
Whatever way you look at it, it's just like an odd opinion. So like, it's out of our realm of judgment because that's not like how humans react.
Yeah, and that's a good qualifying statement because, neither of those episodes certainly we have any experience with. Anything else? Jackson thought. His facial contortions are fun to watch. You should turn around sometimes and just like.
It's like when Darth Anakin comes back as Darth Vader, and he's like, "Yo, where's Padme?" And then he's like, "Padme's dead because you killed her." And then he.
Elena just completely tuned you out. Like, where are you going with this?
That's what I was thinking of.
Keep going though. That's fine.
No, it's not.
When did Dresden happen? That's good. How long have him and Valencia been married at this point? 18 years, because they've just had the party. The thing for me that I find peculiar, I guess, certainly would be, and I think Olivia's, he's like almost unhuman, where there's not that mourning that seems to kind of be taking place for Valencia, although we know that the relationship was never necessarily what we would kind of look at as being ideal. The part that he really starts to focus on, and that he really even needs to emphasize to people, was the fact that he was there. And this is the time that I'm going to recall Dresden. After his plane accident has taken place, after his wife has died, he doesn't focus on her, but he focuses back on kind of like the disaster that has taken place. And I can't say I fault him for it, because again, who am I to say what's right or wrong in a situation like that? But I would say this kind of ends up then being the plague that kind of starts everything for him. The last part on the back of your sheet, below the human dignity, goes Billy, is he a hero or a victim? And you can certainly argue kind of neither in some ways. But that part, for me, starts to emphasize the victim quality, where regardless of whatever happens to him in his life, this is that one cloud that is always going to be over him. He doesn't even have really, you could argue, the ability to properly mourn, process everything that's going on in a point that would probably be his lowest of lows. It is still what is his sole focus at that point. And it's remarkable that would be for a guy who we don't assume really cares about anything, that he's so apathetic. But if he has to prove back to Rumford that I actually was there, it does matter to him. There is something about that does sort of kind of define who he is, and that's where I kind of feel bad for him. I don't like Billy, personally. I think he is kind of wimpy and weak, and you would hope there would be a little bit more action that would take place. But I do kind of start to look at him as being a victim in that sense, that no matter what kind of person you are, there are some events that end up kind of having that puppet master controlling aspects, and for him, Dresden ends up being that, which I think does kind of reinforce what's Vonnegut's line about a massacre. There is nothing intelligent that can be said about a massacre. There's no point in trying to explain what are the good effects of coming from war, the necessity of war, because there's absolutely nothing intelligent that can be said about it. The only thing we can say about war when it's all said and done, and we don't even say it's the animals that have to come up with it. What does it mean? Who knows? But we certainly aren't going to be able to figure it out until we're able to kind of get out of that endless cycle of blowing people up. and that's why the guns from his father at the end. This would be Vonnegut talking about what happens to him. They rust because he's certainly not going to use them. I think at the end, did you pick up on the prediction as to how many people were going to be in the world by the end of the century? What was his number? Said by 2000, it's going to be 7 billion. Again, he's writing this in 1969. That ends up being pretty accurate. And he also had the bumper sticker for President Reagan. No, that's million. Right? Too many commas. And all of them are going to want human dignity. Is that possible? And I think you could even step back a little bit further and go, what does it mean to have dignity? Is Ray a dignified character? I'm not seeing a groundswell of support coming. Who's the most dignified person in this room? Can't say that. What I think one of certainly the universal things that comes up, you do have these questions about free will. You know, do we have the ability to kind of determine things in our life? Do we all have dignity, or do we have control over some of these aspects? And you can't really get a yes or no question. I think it tends to be a little bit more philosophical. But if anything, I think it was in the afternoon, and some other people might have said it too, what do you look for in a book? Something that makes me think. And so even if you can't get an answer necessarily to those questions, but it's still causing you to ponder them, mission accomplished from the writer's standpoint.